Hello everyone. My name's Gilly Carr and I'm at the University of Cambridge, and I'm an archaeologist and a historian, and I also work in Holocaust studies. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the Channel Islands, and in particular one Channel Islander whose name was Harold Ledrulenek, and he was from Jersey. And he was reputed to have been the only British survivor at the Liberation of Belsen. And so I'm going to start my presentation now to tell you about him. Now let me just check that I am showing you the right screen. Here we are. Okay, so this is Harold Ledrulenek, and I'm just going to start off with showing you a map of the Channel Islands so you can see precisely where they are, because not everyone knows where they are. And you can see here they are off the coast of France. And these islands have been British since the 13th century. And in order of size, the Channel Islands are Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark, and Herm. And they were occupied between the end of June, beginning of July 1940, depending on which island you were in. And they were liberated on the 9th of May 1945. So that's a day after Victory in Europe Day. So at the beginning of the occupation, everyone had to register. And this is an image of the occupation registration card of the hero of this presentation, of Harold Ledrulenek. And everybody had to have a card like this. And they're very useful for researchers. I'm going to be showing you some original material during my talk. And I think it's very useful for you to see what it is that historians have access to, and therefore how they can build up their story. And so this is a typical occupation registration card, and as you can see, it gives Harold Ledrulenek's date of birth, his occupation, and his address, and of course a photograph. And at the beginning of the German occupation, he was 28 years old and a schoolmaster in Jersey. Now, I think it's worth just saying a little bit about Harold's name. You'll have noticed that he has a French name. And many Channel Islanders, many sort of indigenous Channel Islanders have Norman or Breton names. But as I'm sure you all know, English is the main language spoken in the Channel Islands, and only a very small percentage of people can speak the original patois, or the original language, which is a form of Norman French. You know, my grandfather could speak it. My family's from the Channel Islands. Anyway, let me tell you about Harold. Now, during the occupation, we know about Harold because of something that he and his sister Louisa Gould did. So in this slide, you can see Louisa on the right. And Louisa lived in the parish of St. Wands, and St. Wands is in the northwest part of Jersey. And she ran a shop, and she had two sons, Ralph and Edward. And Edward was killed during the Second World War. Of course, they were serving in the armed forces. And Louisa felt so awful at losing her son that she wanted to do something for another mother's son, as she put it. And this particular quote that we know from Louisa is associated with the story of Fyodor Bury, or Bill Bury, as the locals called him. Now, this was a Russian slave worker. Now, in this photograph, of course, this was taken after the war, but during the war, there were thousands of Russian slave workers who were brought to the Channel Islands to build the Atlantic Wall. Now, although the locals called them Russians, they were people from Ukraine, from Belarus, and from Eastern Europe, places such as Poland, as well as Russia. But these people, the Channel Islanders, could see them because the Russian slave workers were working on building projects around the island. They were put on marches every morning between their camps and their places of work, and islanders would leave out bits of food for them or clothing, things like that, even though it was forbidden to do so. And one day, this young man, this Russian young man, escaped from his camp and knocked on Louisa's door and asked if she would help him. And she did. And she took him in. She wanted to do something, as I say, for another mother's son. And she took care of him for 18 months. But she wasn't alone in that work. Her brother, Harold, helped her, even though Russian Bill, as he was called, lived with Louisa. Harold helped, and other members of the family helped, and some of Louisa's friends helped as well. But Harold and Louisa and those 4 friends were informed upon by some neighbours of Louisa's. And the reason why they informed upon her, we don't really know why they did it. Probably they saw Louisa as someone who was getting away with breaking the rules. And if the Germans found out, maybe there would be repercussions for everyone. Perhaps they were unimpressed because Louisa ran a local store and perhaps had access to food that they didn't. We don't really know what kind of petty jealousies caused these neighbours to inform upon her, but they did. And so in June 1944, when Bill had been staying with Louisa for 18 months, Harold and Louisa and 4 of their friends were arrested. And we can see here I've made little clips from the charge sheets that were typed up. And you can see here it says Harold Ledruelnek of Westdean, Langley Avenue, St Saviour, born 5th of August 1911 in St One, sentenced to 5 months imprisonment for prohibited reception of wireless transmissions in the company of other persons. Now, Harold would gather around the radio with Louisa and Bill and the others. And it is worth pointing out, as you may know, that radios were confiscated in the Channel Islands in June 1942. And so if you were caught listening to the radio, or still in possession of a radio, it would be enough to secure your arrest and deportation and quite possibly death in a concentration camp. And quite a number of Channel Islanders died in camps after being caught listening to the radio. And let's just have a look at Louisa's here. It says Louisa Gould, née Ledruelnek of St One, born 7th of October 1891 in St One, sentenced to a total of 2 years imprisonment for failing to surrender a wireless receiving apparatus, prohibited reception of wireless transmissions, and abetting breach of the working peace and unauthorized removal. I think this refers to the unauthorized removal of Bill from his camp. But of course, Louisa wasn't responsible for removing him. He had escaped himself. Well, Louisa and Harold were deported on the 30th of June 1940. And this map shows the route that they were sent. And it's worth just focusing on this date, because you'll see that the 30th of June 1944, well, this is after the D-Day landings. And of course, that part of France was being progressively invaded and taken by the Allies. And so 30th of June 1944 is seen by historians who have studied this period. There's only 3 of us in Europe who focus on this part of the German occupation of Europe. And it's clear that this is pretty much the cutoff date by which the Germans could continue to deport people from the Channel Islands, because after that, taking people from the islands to the nearest part of the French coast, which would be Granville or St Malo, that part of France would have been liberated by the Allies any later. And I have come across the testimony of a Channel Islander who was deported just a few days later. He survived, but when he arrived in France, he talked about there being gun battles, and the Germans trying to take him away were overrun by the Allies. And, you know, there's really, there's just a very fine window at the end of June when people could be deported. But Harold and Louisa were sent from Jersey to St. Malo. From St. Malo, they were sent to Rennes, to the Jacques Cartier prison. And from there, they went across France to Fort Hattery in Belfort. And they described that place, or rather, Harold described that place as a slave market. And so one rather gets the impression that this is the place where a lot of a lot of occupied people who had been put in prisons by the Nazis. It's almost like this place became a kind of holding camp where the Nazis could then take people away to labor camps to work for them. And so this was a kind of a sort of holding pen, if you like, on the edge of France near the German border where people could be taken further on. So at this point, when they left Fort Hattery, this was the last time that Harold saw his sister Louisa, because Louisa was taken from here to Ravensbrück concentration camp. And she died in Ravensbrück in February 1945. She died in the gas chamber. And but Harold was taken to, first of all, to Neuengamme concentration camp. And then a week later, he went to Alter Banteweg camp. And this was, he was on an Arbeitskommando from Neuengamme. And at Alter Banteweg camp, he worked, we'll get onto that. Let me not get ahead of the story, but and then he was sent on to Belsen. But let's spend a little bit more time looking at those historical records. Now, on this slide, I want to address this question of how do we know where Harold and Louisa were sent? Now, I've already said that Louisa died in Ravensbrück. So Harold, who, as you've probably guessed already, had survived, was due to survive the war, he was able to write what happened to him later on. Now, in a little later in this presentation, we will be looking at the compensation claims of the 1960s, when Brits could get compensation from the German government. We'll talk about that in a bit, but in order to get compensation, you had to write a testimony about where you'd been and also give the places and the dates of where you'd been. And for any of you out there who have ever tried to go to the, look at the records from the Arolsen Archives, or the International Tracing Service, as it used to be known, you can find out, you can see, you can get access to the records from German prisons and camps, but it's much harder to get any records from France. And French records, French prison records, a lot of them don't survive. And speaking as someone who has tried to recreate the traces of all Channel Islanders who were deported, finding records from France is difficult. They're not centrally located in Arolsen. For the most part, you have to go to various different towns and cities in France and go to the local archives and look at the prison records if they survive. And in many cases, they don't. So fortunately, we have a compensation claim for Louisa, which was written by her son, Ralph. And Ralph got information from his uncle Harold about where Louisa and Harold had been. So we can see that Ralph wrote on this form. Most of the information I have comes from my uncle, Harold Osmond Ledrulinek, who I understand has given you more details concerning my mother with his application for registration, and we'll look at that later. But he gives dates here of when he was in Jersey prison, when he was sent to St. Malo, when he was sent to Rennes and Belfort. And then it says Ravensbrück here because this is Louisa's form. Now, here's an image of Neuengamme. This is where Harold arrived on the 1st of September 1944. And underneath, I've appended a little note from a record from the International Tracing Service, which I accessed at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And it shows that Harold Ledrulinek arrived at Neuengamme on the 1st of September 1944, and it also gives his prisoner number here, as 43974. You'll see the spelling of his name isn't quite accurate, and I'm sure as anyone knows who's tried to have a look at these records, getting accurate spellings of names is often difficult because they were not always written correctly. And I guess the surname Ledrulinek is not one that anyone apart from other Channel Islanders would necessarily know how to spell. Okay, so as I've said, Harold went to Alterbanteweg camp, the subcamp of Neuengamme, where he worked as a welder. And Harold later wrote about this camp, and he said it was a tough camp with torture and punishment that ruled day and night. Means of putting inmates to death included beating, drowning, crucifixion, hanging in various stances. No one escaped severe corporal punishment. And although Harold didn't talk about punishment that he experienced, this was quite sort of typical in what he wrote, by saying no one escaped severe corporal punishment, it's clear that he too was punished, but we don't know precisely what happened to him at this camp. And although we'll be getting to this later, Harold left significant records about his experiences. And I just wanted to show you a little clip here of his testimony in Alterbanteweg, which is in Wilmshaven. So this one is referred to as a Wilmshaven camp. And I'll show you where you can read those archival records yourself, because I've put them all online. So we'll get onto that in just a short while. Well, on the 5th of April 1945, Harold was sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And yes, this was very late in the war, and yes, this was shortly before the camp was liberated. But at the same time, Harold had, I mean, as we know, Belsen got progressively worse towards the end. Harold had 5 days in a cattle truck before he got there. And when he arrived, he said, Belsen was a place of no food, no water. Sleep was impossible. We had to rise at 3:30 a.m. All my time here was spent in heaving dead bodies into mass graves. Jungle law reigned among the prisoners. At night, you killed or were killed. By day, cannibalism was rampant. Well, I mean, you know, what we know of what Harold did there, and we can only judge from his writings. And he talks about the heaving dead bodies into the graves and the lack of food or water for day after day. Now, what is quite exciting about Harold, I mean, the reason why I've chosen him to speak about is that he left such wonderful records for us. And he contributed in 1946 to a radio play called The Man from Belsen. And the play was written by Leonard Cottrell after interviewing Harold. And that radio play was narrated by Harold. And I thought I would read out to you a couple of small sections from it about the liberation of Belsen, because obviously these words have come from Harold. And we're going to a place in the narrative where Harold is talking to his friend Baudu in the camp. So I'll just pick it up here. Harold, it's true, the British must be very near. Those are their guns. They must be all around the camp. Then, seeing the state I'm in, he adds quietly, there's some fresh grass outside block 26. I've eaten some. It's good. Try it. It'll do you good. There are tanks on the Sel-Winston Road, says Badu. Harold, I said tanks. British or American tanks with a white star on them. Wake up and listen. The guards have gone. People are looting the kitchens. Come with me. The gates are open. With a little Baudu by my side, I staggered to the compound gateway. It was open. Prisoners were pouring onto the central road of the camp. I saw, drawn up by the roadside, a British radio truck with officers sitting in it. I thought I rushed up to them, but they told me afterwards that I crawled there. The car was just going to move. Wait, wait, please, I'm a British subject. What's your name? Asked an officer. Captain Sington. Harold Ledrulinek, I'm from the Channel Islands. Harold Ledrulinek, well, I'm not making a practice of this, but you'd better come with us. No, I think you'd better sit on the bonnet. That's better. No, I'm sorry, I can't take your friend. He'll be seen to very soon. Drive on. Goodbye, Harold, called Baudu. You'll write to me, won't you? And so on April the 16th, I left Belsen, sitting on the bonnet of a British radio truck because I was too lousy and too dirty to be allowed inside. I weighed some 90 pounds, and when I saw myself in the mirror for the first time, I looked to see who was there. So as we see, Harold was liberated on the 16th of April. Well, he said it was the 16th. Belsen was liberated on the 15th. And whether Harold himself left the camp the day after, we don't really know. I guess his way of measuring time was, not quite as accurate as it might have been then. But anyway, he weighed only 6 stone, and he was a tall man. I mean, Channel Islanders on the whole are quite short, but Harold was a tall man, so 6 stone was very little. He spent 5 months in hospital recuperating. He was very sick when he was liberated. And one of the important things about Harold is that he testified at the Belsen trial in Lüneburg. Now, I'm going to see if I can take you to a website because that testimony that Harold gave has been put online. So I'm going to see if I can find that page for you now. Okay, so this is the testimony of Harold Ledrulenek. So I'm not going to go through that now, but I'll show you where you can find that later on. I'm sure you'll probably be interested to see that. Harold also testified at the Neuengamme trials in 1946 and the Banterweg trials in 1947. And there's an image of him on the bottom right showing him when he was in Nuremberg. And I'd like to share with you also an interview that he recorded in September 1945 about his experiences in Belsen. And this was broadcast just before the King's speech at Christmas of that year. So let me find it. Here we are. Right, I'm going to play this for you. It's just a couple of minutes long. Now, I do apologize, people. I've just been told that you can't hear anything.
Absolute starvation. Secondly, complete lack of water for some 6 days. Thirdly, lack of sleep. A few minutes sleep can reveal that was occasionally possible. Fourthly, to be covered with rights the fatalistic attitude among the prisoners towards what the end would certainly be the crematorium or the pit. Add to this the foul stench and violence of the place, which we saw for the whole daylight day by day, the blows on the head, the hideous work, and in the last 3 days, the Hungarian guards just as if we were rats. All of it, if you put the sum total, as it were, hitting a man all at once, then maybe you will get a remote inkling of what life was like in Belsen those last 3 days. In the 2 previous months, there was a prisoners, or no new hostages or sailors in the other camps who were worse than Belsen. I think I can fairly describe Belsen as probably the foulest and finest spot that ever soiled the surface.
Okay, so that's quite a remarkable recording. I hope you heard that, but I will be giving you, I will be showing you how you can access that yourself to listen to it. I'm sorry, the technical problems here of juggling between screens on my laptop meant that you might have missed the beginning of that, so I do apologize. Okay, well, I mentioned that Harold contributed to the first anniversary of commemoration of the liberation of Belsen. I mean, Harold was really quite a, well, you know, everyone in the Channel Islands had heard of him because he was, as I say, reputed to be the only British survivor of Belsen at its liberation. And because he had spoken to the BBC at Christmas and he had narrated this radio drama, he was quite a celebrity, really. And so this is why he was chosen to be the voice of the British experience of Belsen in a book I'm showing here. And if you want to read the rest of his story again, I'm going to show you in a tick how you can get hold of that. So this is my website. It's called the Frank Faller Archive. It's named after the man you see in this image. It's named after Frank Faller. He was a Guernseyman who was a victim of Nazi persecution. He was sent to a series of German prisons after being caught circulating an underground newsletter that he contributed to. And he fought in the 1960s to get compensation for Channel Islanders. And his daughter gave me his archive in 2010. And he had collected testimonies of other Channel Islanders. And so I wrote this website in his honor to tell the story of all deported Channel Islanders. Now, I'm just going to get you onto that website so you can see it yourself. Let's hope this works. So I am going to take you here and just show you, this is the website. If you go to people and go to L for Ladrulinek, these are all Channel Islanders who were deported to Nazi prisons and camps for acts of resistance. And also it tells the story of Jewish Channel Islanders deported and their experiences in camps. And so if you go to this website, you can see Harold, you can see a list of the camps that he went to. You can click on those and read about them. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can see the map of where he went, but you can also see a link here, The Man from Belsen by Leonard Cottrell. You can read that story. You can read Harold's testimony as well. And we'll get onto that in just a second. And I'm just going to say a word before finishing about the 1960s compensation claim. So as I say, in 1964, British victims of Nazi persecution were allowed to claim compensation for time in a Nazi concentration camp or a similar institution, and at least 100 Channel Islanders applied for this money. Over 200 have been deported, possibly as many as 250. I've tracked down about 225 so far. Harold is third from the right in this image, and it shows a group of some of the men who got compensation, who got together to celebrate getting compensation. And this is the first page of Harold's application. You can read it on the website I just showed you. and you can also read everything else that he said about about his experience in the camp. So, my apologies. I just wanted to show you a couple more images, and that is that in 1966, at the height of the Cold War, 20 islanders in Jersey were honoured by the Russian government for having sheltered slave workers, and Harold was one of them, and they were given this gold watch. So this isn't Harold's, this was one that was given to somebody else, but they all got identical gold watches from the Russian ambassador. And the final slide I'm going to show you is that Harold Ledrulenek was made a British hero of the Holocaust in 2010. He was one of the first, he was honoured at the first ceremony for the British Heroes of the Holocaust. But of course, Harold had died in 1985, and in a wheelchair here is his wife, Phyllis, who is no longer alive, but she received the honour on behalf of Harold. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing about Harold Ledrulenek, certainly a British hero and survivor of Belsen. And if you want to read more about him or any other Channel Islanders, please go to the Frank Feller Archive website. Thank you.